My daughter's new friend never sleeps, based on a true story.
It began on one of those August days when summer, still genuinely hot and bright, already feels the breath of approaching autumn on its neck. The air, recently sultry and thick, was now threaded with faint, invisible filaments of coolness, heralding the imminent leaf fall. I stood by the open trunk of the moving van, watching as the last boxes of our modest belongings disappeared into the dark, gaping maw of the 9-story concrete apartment block's entrance. In my hand, I clutched a key, small, cold, utterly unremarkable, but for me, it was a symbol of a beginning, albeit a forced one, and an end. The end of my hopes for a different, unfulfilled life. This first-floor apartment was my old premarital life, the cocoon from which I had once emerged to meet a future that had turned out less radiant than I'd dreamed. I had moved here after college, young, full of ambition, and a belief in my own invincibility. Here, I had brewed my first coffee in my first kitchen, listened to music until dawn, and dreamed by the window, watching children run around in the courtyard. Now I was returning, not in triumph, but with a quiet, bitter resignation to fate, my 7-year-old daughter in tow, like the sole trophy salvaged from the battlefield of a collapsed marriage. The divorce, the financial struggles, the necessity of starting over from scratch, all of it had led me back to these pale blue walls and the creaking parquet floor. The return was a bitter pill, but there was no other way. "Mom, is our new room big?" Katya, my daughter, tugged at the hem of my t-shirt. Her large gray eyes, an inheritance from her father, looked up with curiosity mixed with a barely perceptible anxiety. She felt my tension like a tiny barometer. "Just like before, sweetie, cozy. And the window looks out on the courtyard. You can feed the birds," I said, running a hand through the girl's soft hair, trying to infect her with at least a semblance of optimism. The apartment was, in truth, the most ordinary kind. A typical 2-room layout in a Soviet-era concrete panel building. A cramped, dim hallway led to a small living room, from which a door on the left went to the bedroom, and on the right, to a tiny, narrow kitchen. A separate bathroom which had once been considered a big plus. The wallpaper I had once put up with my mother had faded and was peeling at the seams in places. The parquet creaked in familiar, almost familial spots, and rusty water whistled from the kitchen tap until you let it run. It was a web of my memories, and now we had to live in it, becoming even more entangled. The first few days flew by in a whirlwind of chores, the endless unpacking of boxes, arranging furniture, attempts to breathe at least a drop of life and warmth into the sterile space that smelled of dust and loneliness. Katya helped as best she could, but my nostalgia was clearly lost on her. The girl explored the corners with a cautious interest, peered into my old albums with yellowed photographs, and constantly asked if this was where I slept when I was little, if this had been my favorite chair. "I lived here when I was already a grown-up," I laughed, unpacking dishes. "But yes, your bed is in the exact same spot where mine was. See, this dent in the floor from the bedpost?" We settled in as best we could. Life, albeit creakily, began to find its rhythm. Work, school, the grocery store, home. But within a couple of weeks, by the start of September, as a golden autumn took hold, I began to notice oddities, small cracks in the mundane that I tried to ignore at first. Katya had always been a morning person. She used to wake with the first rays of sun, cheerful and chirping like a sparrow, chattering non-stop through breakfast. Now it was as if she'd been replaced. The alarm clock, set for 7, would ring, then ring again and again. I had to go into her room 3 or 4 times, shake my daughter, almost forcibly pull the blanket off her. Her body was limp, unyielding. "Katya, get up, you'll be late. We're going to be late. Katya, get up, you'll be late. We're going to be late. Katya, get up, you'll be late. And we will be late. Mom, I'm so tired," she would rasp, burying her face in the pillow. Her voice was hoarse with sleep, but it held not a child's laziness, but a real profound exhaustion. Her face was pale, waxy, with dark, unnatural shadows under her eyes, as if she hadn't been allowed to sleep for a week. I chalked it all up to adjustment. The new old place, a new class at school, we'd had to transfer because of the move, the end of summer freedom. I told myself firmly, she's acclimatizing, brewing stronger coffee for myself and in the form of sweet tea for my daughter. She'll get into the rhythm. She'll catch up on sleep on the weekend.
But Katya didn't. With each day, waking her became harder. She grew listless and apathetic, stopped drawing, which she had loved,
and went for walks reluctantly, almost resisting. In the evenings, doing homework, she would lay her head on the open math textbook and fall asleep right at the table, a pencil clutched in her fingers. "Katya, what's wrong? Are you feeling sick?" I worried, feeling her forehead. It was cool. The thermometer showed a normal temperature. "No, Mom, I just want to sleep all the time, constantly." One evening, tucking my daughter in, I noticed her staring intently, with an unchildlike seriousness, into the dark corner of the room opposite the bed. In that corner stood a tall wardrobe, casting a strange, fractured shadow. "What is it?" I asked, starting slightly. "Nothing," Katya answered quickly, almost fearfully, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. "Just a shadow. Good night, Mom." I wrote it off as a child's fantasy, a trick of the light and shadow. Maybe the wardrobe looked like a monster in the semi-darkness. I kissed my daughter firmly, left the nightlight on, a little bunny casting a soft yellow glow, and went out, closing the door behind her. The turning point came in mid-September, when the city was drowning in crimson and gold. I was at work, sorting through boring reports, when my mobile phone rang with an unknown number tagged School Number 114. "Hello, Margarita Viktorovna. This is Elena Petrovna, Katya's homeroom teacher. Could you possibly come by today after classes? I'd like to speak with you." My heart sank. Every parental anxiety, every fear reared its head at once. Was she sick? Had she misbehaved? Was someone bullying her? Had something happened? "Of course I'll come. Is Katya all right? Has something happened?" Yes, she's physically fine, don't worry. It's just, there are certain things that concern me. It's better to talk in person." The hours until the end of the workday dragged on agonizingly, each minute like a year. I ran through every possible scenario in my head, but none seemed satisfactory. Anxiety tightened around my heart like a ring of ice. Elena Petrovna, a woman in her 50s with intellectual, attentive eyes behind thin metal-framed glasses, was waiting for me in the empty classroom. The desks were vacant, traces of chalk from the last lesson still on the board. Katya had already gone home. "Margarita Viktorovna, thank you for making the time. I wouldn't bother you over trifles," the teacher began, gesturing to a chair near the teacher's desk. "But I must confess I'm very worried about Katya." "What's wrong? She's been so listless. I've been worried myself. I don't know what to think." It's not just the listlessness. For the last several days, she has been literally sleeping in class. At first I made remarks, woke her up, tried to engage her, but today, during reading, she fell asleep so deeply that I couldn't wake her for a good 10 minutes. When she came to, she was completely disoriented, couldn't understand where she was, and looked at me with a blank, unseeing gaze. I felt goosebumps run down my spine. This was no longer just not getting enough sleep. This was something else. "I don't know what to think," I whispered, bewildered. "At home, she goes to bed at 9. I tuck her in myself. I read to her. No phones, no gadgets. She should be getting enough sleep." "That's what I assumed. You always stroke me as a very responsible mother." So today, when she started nodding off again, I took her aside, into the corridor, and asked her directly, without any reproach, "Katya, dear, why are you sleeping so poorly at night? What's keeping you up?" Elena Petrovna paused, her fingers with their short-clipped nails tapping nervously on the desk. "You know, children her age often fantasize, and I'm ready to write it off to an active imagination or night terrors. But her answer frightened me, sincerely frightened me." "What did she say?" My voice trembled, growing quieter and lower. She said, "I don't sleep at night. I play with a girl. She lives in our apartment. She comes to me after everyone's asleep and makes me play with her." The classroom became utterly silent. The ticking of the large wall clock with its pendulum suddenly seemed deafeningly loud, marking each agonizingly long second. "Makes me?" I repeated, feeling my fingertips go cold and a heavy, icy lump form in my stomach. "Yes, that exact word," I clarified, trying to stay calm. "And if you don't want to, if you're tired?" And Katya looked at me with her huge gray eyes and said, "But I can't refuse. She gets so very upset then. She cries. And I feel so sorry for her, so sorry that my heart aches and I wake up and go play with her. And if I say no or try not to wake up, she can scream so loudly in my head that it hurts and I wake up anyway." Margarita Viktorovna, she said this absolutely seriously, without a hint of make-believe or a smile, as if it were a matter of fact, a daily routine, like brushing her teeth. The world around me swum, the colors outside the window blending into a messy, rusty scarlet swirl. I grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling. Everything fell into place. The chronic fatigue, the dark circles under her eyes, the fear of bedtime, the stare into the empty corner. These were not whims, not adjustment, not an illness. This was something inexplicable, irrational, and the all the more terrifying for it.
Thank you, Elena Petrovna. I exhaled with difficulty, standing up. My legs felt like cotton wool. I understand. I'll look into it. Thank you for telling me. The drive home was a blur. I didn't remember driving, shifting gears, or swerving around potholes. I drove on autopilot, a single question echoing in my head. What is happening in my home? I entered the apartment and was met by the familiar smell of old dust, boiled potatoes, and something else, barely perceptible, sweetish and musty, that I hadn't noticed before. Katya was sitting on the floor in the living room, leaning against the sofa, watching cartoons. But her gaze was absent. She didn't laugh at the funny parts. The girl turned at the sound of the door, and on her face I saw clearly for the first time, not just tiredness, but a real, profound exhaustion, like that of an old woman weary of life. Her childhood had vanished, evaporated over these few weeks. Katya, I began quietly, taking off my coat and sitting down beside her on the carpet. We're friends, right? And we never lie to each other. Katya nodded silently, staring at her socks. Tell me about the girl, the one you play with at night. Please, I need to know. Katya's face twisted with inner conflict. She looked down, nervously fiddling with the edge of her sweater. It was clear she was afraid. You'll be angry. You'll say I'm making it up. No, sweetie, I won't be angry, I promise. I want to help you. You see how tired you are. This isn't normal. Let's figure it out together. Katya took a deep breath, as if gathering her strength, and began to speak, looking at some point in the space before her, as if reciting a long memorized story. She came on the very first night we moved in. I woke up because someone touched my hand, gently, like this. Katya touched her own wrist. There was a girl standing by the bed. She was a little older than I am, I think, maybe 7, and she was in a white dress, long, almost to the floor, and her hair was light, like mine, but very, very long, right down to her waist. She didn't say her name. When I asked, she shook her head. She just asked, "Will you play with me?" And I thought it was a dream, a really vivid one. The girl, according to Katya, wasn't aggressive. On the contrary, she seemed very sad and lonely at first. Playing with her was even interesting, unusual at first. They built castles from blocks that weren't really in the room, drew glowing, shimmering pictures in the air with their fingers, whispered quietly so not to wake me. But with each day, with each night, the girl became more insistent, more demanding. She started coming earlier, almost right after you leave the room and turn off the hall light. And if I say I'm tired and want to sleep, or just don't want to play, she changes. Her face becomes different, ugly, mean, and she starts to cry. But it's not a normal cry. Mom, this cry, it's right inside my head. It's so loud, so piercing, that my head feels like it's splitting, like it's being squeezed in a vice. And I feel so sorry for her. Such a wave of sadness comes over me that my heart breaks. It's better to just play than to listen to that. To play until she says it's enough, I can sleep now, and that's almost always just before morning. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, barely holding back tears and rising horror. Why did you keep it a secret? She said that if I told anyone, especially you, she would go away, and it would be even worse for me, because I'd be all alone, and the sadness would be so bad I couldn't stand it. That night, I slept in the same bed with Katya. I didn't believe in ghosts. I was a rational person, raised on science fiction and logic. Let's blame it on stress, overexertion, a shared sleep paralysis, and childhood nightmares, I told myself, staring at the ceiling. It all has a scientific explanation. But a part of me, a deep, instinctive, maternal part, quivered with animal fear. I felt I was dealing with something real, dark, and unexplainable. I woke to a faint rustle, like the sound of a silk dress. The clock on the nightstand showed 2:45. The night outside was thick, impenetrable. The room was plunged in semi-darkness, lit only by the sickly, dim light of a street lamp filtering through the cracks in the thick curtains. Katya was sitting up in bed. Her eyes were open, but her gaze was empty and unseeing, glassy like a sleepwalker's. Her breathing was even, but too slow. "Katya?" I called out softly, almost soundlessly. The girl didn't react. Slowly, like a marionette, she slid off the bed and stood in the middle of the room, barefoot, in just her pajamas. Then she turned her head and stared directly at that same empty corner where the wardrobe stood. "I don't want to play hide and seek today," Katya whispered in her own voice, yet somehow alien, tired, adult. "I'm so tired, so tired. Please." The room grew cold. I felt it on my skin, a sharp, bone-penetrating chill emanating not from the window, but from that very corner. The air became thick, heavy, syrupy. It was hard to breathe. There was a pressure in my chest. "Please," Katya said again, and real bitter tears were audible in her voice. "Leave me alone tonight. I can't." And then I saw her. Not with my eyes, because the corner, if looked at directly, still held only the wardrobe shadow. Rather, with some kind of internal vision, vague, peripheral, and alarming. An indistinct, wavering silhouette in the corner. Small, girlish, a white smudge like a blurred spot on a photograph, and a feeling of all-consuming, age-old, infinite sorrow, so acute and painful that it stole my breath and brought tears to my eyes. There were no sounds, but I almost physically felt a silent, persistent, demanding call emanating from that patch of darkness. A call to play, to not let go, to never let go. I jerked upright, thrust out my arm, and snapped the light switch. The room was flooded with bright, almost blinding electric light. The shadow in the corner vanished. The cold retreated as if it had never been. Katya, like an unplugged doll, softly crumpled to the floor. I rushed to her, gathered her in my arms. Her body was icy, like a fish. She slept, unconscious, in a deep, death-like slumber until morning. The next morning, I called work and said I wouldn't be in, citing my daughter's illness. I sat a pale, silent, seemingly hollowed-out Katya down for breakfast and took my laptop. This was no longer anxiety, but a cold, purposeful fury and resolve. I had to understand what I was dealing with. I Googled everything I could. Gagarin Street 25 building history, first floor, panel building incidents, apartment 14, bad apartment. I scoured local city forums, community groups on social networks, typed in old addresses. At first, I found nothing. The standard, boring history of a late 80s construction. No mentions of tragedies or scandals. Growing desperate, I took a different path. I remembered an old neighbor, Auntie Luda, who had lived in the building and the apartment across the hall since it was first occupied. That woman had always loved to chat, to gossip, and knew everything about everyone, keeping a whole chronicle of the building in her memory. Auntie Luda, much aged and stooped but still as lively and talkative as ever, gladly let me into her apartment that smelled of cabbage pies, lavender, and mothballs. "Margarita, my dear, you've come back to us. And this must be your daughter? The spitting image of you, just a perfect copy," she chattered, seating us at a table covered with knitted doilies and pouring tea into faceted glasses. "Auntie Luda, I've come to you with a question. You know everyone here. Do you remember who lived in my apartment before me and before I bought it? It's very important." The old woman frowned, her face, wrinkled like a baked apple, turning serious. The mask of hospitality slipped away, revealing a sadness stored up over the years. Slowly, with a quiet clink, she set the aluminum teapot aside and began nervously picking at the fringe of a knitted doily, as if counting the beads of a long-ago tragedy. "Before you?" she drawled, looking somewhere past me, into the past. "It was rented out by some man, not from here, one of those out-of-towners, rarely showed up, got the money by transfer. And before him," Auntie Luda fell silent, thinking. "That was a long time ago, about 20 years, I think. Not 25, no, 19. It was when they planted those poplars in the yard. Remember how lush they got?" I nodded silently, unable to utter a word, afraid to scare off the fragile thread of memory. A family lived there, young still, but not newlyweds. A family like any other. He, Sergei, was a foreman at the plant. She, Irina, worked at our library. Quiet, calm people, and they had a daughter. The old woman's voice quivered, and she started fiddling with the doily again. They called her Anushka, Anna, a girl about 7 years old. Went to that same school in the 2nd micro-district, the one your girl goes to now. Auntie Luda fell silent, gathering her thoughts, her strength to utter the heaviest part. The air in the kitchen grew thick and viscous, like molasses. A grief befell them, a big, black, unjust grief.
She exhaled and her eyes, faded with time, grew moist, glistening with unshed tears. The girl, you see, was sick. Her heart, a complicated defect like that. They even operated on her at the regional hospital. Seemed to go well. She was recovering. They even discharged her home. And then, the most mundane thing, a cold, sniffles, a slight fever. Nothing terrible, you'd think. But a weakened body like that, it gave her a complication in that very heart. Myocarditis, I think the doctors called it. The old woman paused, took a sip of tea with a trembling hand. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was winter, frosty, snowy. Anushka had been so looking forward to winter, to sledding, and there she was, lying in her room, pale as a sheet, breathing heavily. They called an ambulance, the doctors fought, but they couldn't save her. Her little heart just stopped. 7 years old, in her own bed. Auntie Luda crossed herself, and her hand trembled finely, tracing a cross in the air. She passed the poor little thing, quietly, in her sleep. I went cold inside, not with the sharp, stabbing ice of a fall, but with a heavy, sorrowful numbness. Everything fell into place with a new, even more piercing and hopeless clarity. A girl, 7 years old, Anna, a long illness, death in her own room, in her own bed, the very one where Katja now slept. And what happened to the parents? I forced out, feeling a lump rise in my throat. The parents? Auntie Luda gave a bitter, short, dry laugh. They broke, both of them. Irina, the mother, she didn't cry. She just fell silent, stopped speaking. She walked around the apartment like a ghost, stroking Anushka's things, folding them, rearranging them. And then they took her to a psychiatric hospital. Not for long, a couple of months. They patched her up, sort of. Sergei held on, tried to be strong, but you could see the man was hollow, an empty shell. They tried to live, yes, tormented themselves, chewing over their grief, looking at each other and seeing the same emptiness in the other's eyes. And then, I guess the heart gave out. Not his, no. The heart of their family. They just one day packed their things, the bare necessities, and everything that reminded them of their daughter, they put in black bags and threw out. Sold the apartment for a song just to be quick, and left. Disappeared. Where to? I don't know. Nobody knows. I never saw them again. She looked at me with a direct, piercing gaze. The apartment stood empty for several years after that. People whispered that it was no good, that a sorrow hung there so thick you could hardly breathe, that Anushka hadn't found peace, that she was still waiting for her mom and dad to return, for someone to play with her. And then that out-of-towner, not from here, he wasn't afraid of the rumors. He bought it. And you, well, you came back. I sat motionless, trying to process what I had heard. This wasn't a sudden death, an accident, but a long, methodical fading, a long illness, the nauseating smell of medicine, doctors whispering in the corridor, helpless hopes and bitter disappointment, and death. Not beyond the threshold, but here, inside, within these walls saturated with fear, pain, and despair. A girl who didn't run or jump, but spent most of her short life in bed. A girl who was lonely, bored, and scared. A girl who had never had her fill of play. And now, stuck in this place, she had finally found a healthy, lively friend to catch up on all she'd missed. And to play, it seemed, until the point of exhaustion. I thanked Auntie Luda, left her apartment in a near-faint state, and returned to my own. So that's who she was. The girl who never grew up. The girl who remained forever there, on the first floor, within the panel walls, saturated with her parents' grief and despair. The girl who was bored, who wanted to play, who craved companionship. Always. Her loneliness had lasted for decades, and now she had found a friend. She had found my daughter, and she had no intention of letting go. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. I sat on the bed next to Katja, who was sleeping soundly, thanks to sheer exhaustion, and stared at that very corner. I didn't see anything more, didn't feel the cold, but I perceived a presence. Quiet, insistent, pleading, hungry, and infinitely, inexpressibly sorrowful. It was a sorrow deep enough for 100 adult lifetimes. I tried to talk to it, aloud, in a whisper, so as not to wake my daughter. I know about you. I know your name was Anya. I am terribly sorry for you, terribly. I can't imagine what it's like. But you can't do this. You cannot take my daughter. She cannot be your friend, your replacement. She needs sleep. She needs to grow, to learn, to live her own life. Do you understand? Please, let her go. Leave. Find your peace." No answer came, but the chill in the air seemed to thicken, to become hostile. The silence in response was more eloquent than any words. In the morning, Katya woke with a savage, pressing headache. She remembered almost nothing of the night's event, only fragments of dreams, a lonely girl in white calling to her from the darkness, and an all-consuming feeling of guilt and pity. "Mom, she was angry today," Katya whispered at breakfast, barely touching her porridge. "After you spoke, I heard you speaking. She said you want to drive her away, and that if you drive her away, she will never let me go. Never. We will play together forever." In that moment, I understood everything. Finally and irrevocably, this was no simple pretend, no game of imagination or mental disorder that could be cured with pills. This was a battle for my living child's soul, her consciousness, her health, and her future. Rational explanations, visits to psychologists, even strong sedatives, nothing would have helped. We were dealing with something that defied logic, had no physical form, but was no less real and dangerous for it. It was an entity, born of grief, stuck between worlds and thirsting for any connection, for anyone's attention, even at the cost of another child's life. I looked at my daughter's exhausted, almost translucent face, at her existing eyes, which held not a trace of their former cheerfulness, and made the only decision possible in my situation. The decision of a mother for whom nothing is more important than her own child. "We're leaving, sweetie. Today. Right now." I called my parents and briefly, without unnecessary detail, explained that the apartment had bad energy and we needed to move, urgently, immediately. Fortunately, they were able to help. By evening, having hastily thrown the most necessary things into suitcases and leaving the bulk of our belongings in the cursed apartment, we were in a rented flat in an old but cozy brick building in another part of the city. The first night, Katya slept like the dead, without waking or tossing, for 10 hours straight. Her breathing was even and deep. The next morning, the dark circles under her eyes no longer seemed so ominous, and a glimmer of life appeared in her gaze. Weeks passed. Katya gradually, day by day, returned to life. Slowly at first, then faster. She began to laugh again, quietly and timidly at first, then with her old ringing laugh. She got out her paints and album again, and her drawings once again featured suns, flowers, and funny cats instead of dark corners and white silhouettes. She went to school willingly, without her former apathy. The dreams of the girls stopped, as if they had never been. The cold, the feeling of another's sorrow, and the heavy, oppressive presence no longer pursued us. The house was simply a house. One evening, as she was getting ready for bed in her new, bright room, Katya put her arms around my neck and pressed her cheek against mine. "You know, Mom, I feel sorry for her too. That girl. Very much. She just really wanted to be friends with someone. She was alone. But she was too strong. Too much." I understood. Grief, especially grief unprocessed, unreleased, unwept to its end, possessed its own terrifying, vampiric strength. It could attach itself to a place, to things, to people, seeking comfort and warmth where it could not and should not be, feeding on the life force of others. It wasn't evil in its essence. It was empty, hungry, and infinitely lonely. We never went back to that apartment. I sold it for a pittance, below market value, without a word to the new, unsuspecting owners about its true, grim history, feeling a dull, aching pang of guilt all the while. But I was a mother. My first and only duty was to protect my living, breathing, real child, even from the ghosts of another's unbearable grief, even at the cost of silence. Months passed. Life settled into a new normal. But sometimes on the quietest, starless nights, when the wind howled out the window in a particular, sorrowful key, I could feel a distant, faint echo, like an echo from a parallel world of that childish, unappeased longing. And I would wish, mentally, from the depths of my soul, for that other girl from the past to finally find her peace, to cross that invisible boundary that separates eternal waiting from eternal sleep, so that she would have no one to play with, so that all children, both the living and the long departed, could finally sleep peacefully,